When I made the trip to Führer headquarters now, approximately 1 kilometer away, I had to dart from cover to cover, watching not only for incoming artillery rounds, but for rifle and machine gun fire as well. From our command bunker, I went straight up Bendlerstrasse to the Tiergarten, then along the south side of the park or through it. The Russians were already in parts of the park, and they fired at all movement. Then onto the southwest corner of the Reich Chancellery across from the park, I would enter the bunker from the basement of the Chancellery. Some of the SS troops defending the Chancellery were dug in before the building. At night, both sides would shoot at any movement. To the people at Führer headquarters, we represented the outside world. Nobody there had left the bunker for several days. They were safe in the bunker, with its many feet of concrete under many feet of earth. But they did not know what was going on outside, that the fighting was only a kilometer away, or that the rescuing armies had been halted. Hitler and the High Command were juggling divisions that no longer existed, or were just skeletons of themselves. Every time I came into the bunker, Martin Bormann especially was eager to know what was happening. He was always there, in the big antechamber in front of Hitler's office and living quarters. Every time I came in, he would insist that I sit down on one of the green leather chairs and have some of his goodies, and tell him about the situation on the outside. It was very important to him to know the situation on the outside before anyone else did. As a civilian chief of staff to Hitler, he had a reputation for being a ruthless intriguer. Everyone knew his power, and everyone had a certain fear of him because he had constant access to Hitler, but he was not held in high esteem by military leaders. The effort to supply us by air had practically ceased, since the east-west axis, the parade avenue through the Tiergarten, was now under constant mortar fire. The last plane that had landed did not make it off the ground again, and was still sitting there, crippled by enemy fire. It was impossible to land ammunition for 50,000 men, let alone to parachute it in. The airdrops had produced only 6 tons of supplies. Above all, there was no way to distribute them to the troops. The situation was such that we still had control of an area shaped like a dumbbell. In the east, we had an area about 3 kilometers in diameter, with the Reich Chancellery in the center. The shaft of the dumbbell was the Heerstrasse, about 8 kilometers long, which was being crossed from time to time by Russian tanks. In spite of that, the subway tunnel under it was still a safe connection to the west, where we still controlled an area about 3 kilometers in diameter surrounding the Olympic Stadium. The fighting out there was being done by the Hitler Youth, who, with exceptional courage, were keeping open the Pichelsdorf Bridge for a possible breakout to the west. The main push of the Russians was directed toward the center of Berlin, which they had attacked from the south, east and north. For some reason, they had not hit upon the simple idea of attacking along the Heerstrasse, which they could reach without much effort, moving east and just driving through the Brandenburg Gate into the center of the city. The city's defenders, the remaining remnants of our 56th Panzer Corps, and General Monke's 1,000 SS troops defending Führer headquarters, were red-eyed and sleepless, living in a world of fire, smoke, death and horror. Much of Berlin was burning like a bonfire. The fighting was being shared by soldiers and civilians alike. When the shelling got bad, the women queuing up for water would press closer to the building walls to hold their places in line. Since such a front could not possibly be held for more than a few days, Weidling decided to make a determined plea to Hitler to break out as long as the route to and across the Pichelsdorf Bridge remained open. Once again, von Duffing and I went over the plan to break out of Berlin to the west and northwest, across the Pichelsdorf Bridge. We worked through the night, preparing the necessary orders and issuing them to the divisions. Only the codename Springstorm was necessary to set everything in motion. Our plan to break out in 3 groups promised real safety for Hitler and the other occupants of Führer headquarters. A group of SS shock troops with about a dozen self-propelled guns would open the way. The 25 or so tanks that were still operational would surround the armored personnel carriers containing Hitler and his entourage to provide flank protection, and the infantry now fighting the Russians in the eastern sectors of Berlin would provide the rear guard. The plan was to start at midnight and be out of the city by morning. We had broken out of encirclement before, in Silesia, and we knew that those riding in armoured personnel carriers in the centre of such a fighting force would get through safely. Once out of Berlin, we would have to march for a few days to the northwest, toward Lübeck. The Russian Air Force was not a big threat because it was not very efficient, although it would certainly lob some bombs at us. At about noon, General Weidling and I took the maps and departed for Führer headquarters. Outside, conditions were more dangerous than ever. Since morning, the Russians had held the Liechtenstein Bridge, and before the day was over, the entire Tiergarten would be in Russian hands. Russian artillery shells were exploding everywhere, causing the earth to tremble and sending dirt, pavement, bricks and other debris high into the air to fall back to earth and injure anyone below. The roar of flames from burning buildings and the crunching sound of falling walls were terrifying. We dashed from doorway to doorway in short bursts to avoid not only shrapnel and other debris from the artillery shells, but also rifle and machine gun fire. At 28, I did not find the running especially strenuous. At 57, General Weidling had a more difficult time. We no longer had to surrender our pistols at Führer headquarters because we were so well known. When we arrived at Hitler's headquarters, several flights of stairs below ground level, the situation briefing had just begun. General Weidling was announced to Hitler and immediately admitted to the briefing room. I waited in the large outer chamber with detailed maps that Weidling might need. The bunker smelled damp, and the sound of the small engine that ran the exhaust system provided a constant background noise. The ever-present Martin Bormann accosted me again. I had one of Bormann's sandwiches and filled him in on the battle that was being waged above ground. After about 45 minutes, the meeting in the briefing room ended. Hitler emerged, followed by Dr. Goebbels, General Krebs, General Weidling, and some other people. I saluted, and Hitler walked toward me. As he neared, I was shocked by his appearance. He was stooped, and his left arm was bent and shaking. Half of his face drooped, as if he'd had a stroke, and his facial muscles on that side no longer worked. Both of his hands shook, and one eye was swollen. He looked like a very old man, at least 20 years older than his 56 years. Weidling presented me to Hitler, saying, "Major Napper, my operations officer." Being accustomed to saying, "Jawohl, Herr General," I automatically said, "Jawohl, Herr," and then, realizing that this was wrong, I quickly corrected to "Jawohl, mein Führer." Hitler smiled faintly, and Goebbels smiled broadly, but Weidling frowned because his subordinate had made a social error. Hitler said goodbye, shook my hand again, and disappeared in the general direction of Goebbels's quarters. Although his behavior had not been lethargic, his appearance had been pitiful. Hitler was now hardly more than a physical caricature of what he had been. I wondered how it was possible that in only 6 years, this idol of my whole generation of young people could have become such a human wreck. It occurred to me then that Hitler was still the living symbol of Germany, but Germany as it was now. In the same 6 years, the flourishing, aspiring country had become a flaming pile of debris and ruin. Weidling and I left the bunker through the basement hallways of the Reich Chancellery. We had found a safe passage through the basement all the way to a window facing Hermann Göringstrasse. "Did he approve the plan?" I asked with trepidation. "No," Weidling said angrily, "but it was the way he did it." This man whom I had seen remain calm under even the most adverse circumstances was so furious that his voice quivered. He listened to my proposal and then he said, "No, Weidling, I do not want to risk dying in the streets like a dog." But our men had been dying in the streets of Berlin every day and every night since we had arrived in the city, and they had died in the streets of other cities before Berlin. For Hitler to be so disrespectful toward the men who were sacrificing their own lives every day just to keep him alive one more day filled me with anger also. Many men who had served under my command had died since the beginning of the war. My own brother had died for Führer and fatherland. No wonder Weidling was angry. We had both been in the war from the beginning, and we had both seen countless deaths in our almost 6 years of war. As soldiers, we had accepted death, even our own if it came as a natural part of our lives. We accepted it as a price we had to pay for a cause we had thought just, at least in the beginning. We were perhaps only now, at the last possible moment, beginning to see clearly what kind of man we had been following. When I reported to the Führer bunker the next day with the daily situation map and saw Hitler going from one room to another in the bunker, my hand moved involuntarily toward my pistol. I had a terribly strong urge to kill him and stop all the suffering. It would have been easy to do, since he had no personal bodyguards inside the bunker. I would not have got out alive, since SS guards were at all the entrances and exits, but I could easily have killed him. Certainly it was not fear of death that stopped the movement of my hand to my pistol. With the escape plan out of the question, my fate was sealed and unavoidable. The Russians had been shooting captured German officers following every battle in their march across Germany. My life would undoubtedly be over in a few days in any case. In the instant I had to make a decision, I must have instinctively concluded that I should not risk making a martyr of Hitler and possibly creating another Dolchstoßlegende. By late April, we no longer had any chance of defending Berlin. The horrible, hopeless battles in the streets continued, but our divisions were little more than battalions. Our morale was poor, and our ammunition was almost gone. Theoretically, we had 4 divisions with which to defend the city, but in fact the divisions were at less than half strength, and that included many wounded. By including Hitler Youth and Volkssturm, We may have had enough bodies to man 4 full divisions, but the Volkssturm was staffed by old men, and the Hitler Youth was composed of children, although some Hitler Youth were somewhat effective in defensive positions. Even if we'd had 4 fully staffed, experienced and rested divisions, we were still a corps fighting 2 army groups. And on top of everything else, we knew we would receive no more ammunition. Being outdoors in the city was becoming more dangerous, because Russian tanks were now driving around the city. German tank hunter groups were chasing them with Panzerfausts, and both were shooting wildly in all directions. To go any place in the city now meant darting from cover to cover, from doorway to doorway, climbing over and around the piles of debris and the decomposing bodies that littered the streets. When a soldier walks over and around and sometimes inadvertently on human corpses daily, his sensibilities start to numb. I was beginning to wonder if we could still be called human. The loud roar of combat filled our days and our nights. We could usually detect from the sound what kinds of weapons were being fired. Mortars sounded slow, artillery shells were a little faster, and heavy artillery was much faster. Of course, the detonation of heavy artillery was much louder than that of light artillery and mortars. We could also tell the direction a shell was coming from by its sound, and we could tell by the sound whether it would pass over our heads or hit in our vicinity. After a while, our senses were automatically tuned to these sounds, and our reactions became instinctive. We still had not given up on the idea of breaking out of Berlin. It was obvious that a breakout could succeed only as long as we could get to the Pichelsdorf Bridge without heavy fighting. The divisions urged us to begin the breakout soon. The morale of the men leaped when they learned about the possibility of a breakout. Weidling kept urging Krebs to press Hitler on the subject, but Krebs said that Hitler could not be made to change his mind. Hitler's refusal frittered away precious hours and days while the Russians constantly reinforced the ring around Berlin, especially to the west of the city.